Hi, my name is Brian Cardell. I'm one of the co-authors of the Extensible Web Manifesto. This is my Twitter handle at Brian Cardell on the screen right here. And I'm going to talk to you about revolution to achieve evolution and how to embrace a living system. Um, Once upon a time, this gentleman named Tim Berners-Lee had been working on an idea for a long time about how we can create this sort of hypertext system. And he's been toying with it and building some kind of preliminary implementations and things and in his spare time. And he's been talking to people at it at CERN for a while, and mostly speaking to deaf ears. Then one day he catches a lucky break where his managers let him develop this as a toy project to prove out something completely different. The idea is really simple. Basically, he takes these existing kinds of protocols and markup languages and just kind of combines them and adds a hypertext link. And he says, keep your OS. We're never going to get you all to agree on that. We're never going to get you to change that. We're never going to get you to change all these systems that you have. Just use this really simple protocol called HTTP. And when I ask you for something like this, then you respond in kind with some HTML. And HTML is an application of SGML, which had been around for a long time. And he said, here's 20 tags, and with it, I think we can start on this idea. So if there had been a Can I Use in 1990, and there had been a spec, which there wasn't, it was just an idea at the time, it might have looked kind of like this, Tim's browser. There were no standards orgs involved. This was just an idea that Tim had. And so he set up a mailing list for it, and at first, there was nobody there except Tim. And so toy project in hand, he has to go and find people in real life and talk to them, like at a meeting or over lunch. And at first, very few people are interested, but some are. Most people are not thinking about things at this level, and they're aware that there are plenty of very well-structured examples, and they're afraid that Tim's unstructured nature will just yield chaos, and it won't be any good. But Tim says that open nature actually is a plus. Like it allows for creativity, and it's more open to more things. And so he goes out and he does convince people, and he has a small group. And by 1992, there are 22 websites and 7 browser implementations. These implementations, they begin to differ. And part of the reason is because of those original 20 tags that he proposed, 7 of them we don't use today. They weren't an especially good 20, but they were the 20 we needed to get the conversation started. So by December of 92, this fragmentation is starting to worry Tim, because he knows that in order for this to work, there can be only one, right? And he thinks that it can get killed before it ever gets off the ground, unless we have a kind of more waterfall approach where we talk about it and agree before anybody implements anything. But the reason I'm saying all this isn't just to give some history lesson, it's to point out that this is actually unsurprising, because this is what happens in nature, and this is how things evolve and how real communication actually happens. Just like Tim had to go and talk to people in real life, and he honed his message, and the system gets increasingly better as it can adapt. This is just how it works. And what's interesting is that this was a different time. I mean, this was a really small group of people and a really small number of pages, and the kinds of things they were doing with were only text. There weren't forms, there weren't scripts, there weren't anything. And so the kind of breakage is a completely different kind of breakage. It's more like an enhancement. And so by 1993, there were 130 websites and 12 browsers, and there's now a HTML plus proposal, which has nearly 80 tags, and there's variants kind of all over the place. So in 1994, the IETF forms a working group to standardize HTML2, they call it. I mean, really, it's the first standard, but it's not, because they recognize the fact that there is a de facto standard that's something under there. And so that is what they do, essentially, is for HTML2, they basically go and codify the de facto standard that's out there. They act like an American dictionary editor, and they look across the common parlance and the vernacular, and they say these things are now standard. And so without a line of code changing, things become a whole lot more standard. And where there are gaps in any implementation, those implementations now have a clear target about what holes they need to go and fill. And this turns out to be a really good thing at a really good time. Users begin to select this system. Not the 50 or so friends of Tim or people that know what the heck we're talking about in terms of longer term architecture or anything. As in nature, people begin selecting this at a high level. Nobody cares about the underlying proteins. They care about what's in it for me. And so authors begin to select this as a way to make pages. And now that there are pages, we're creating an audience. And an increased audience means more demand for more pages and more authors. And that's a really good thing that creates a positive feedback loop that helps the web really take off. But now we're getting kind of past this sort of like pre-alpha software days to the point where this fragmentation would really be a problem. And so Tim's worries on this really begin to matter, and we set up the W3C, as a consortium model to bring together diverse interests, but a small group of interests, to work on how we deal with this problem. And initially they had so many raw materials in the form of things that were already out in the wild that they pretty quickly came to an agreement on HTML 3.2 and HTML4. And that, in turn, was great and helped feed into the positive feedback loop that really, really helped the web solidify its dominant position. But then we start treating it more like a standards body. And I'm not saying this to point out any kind of flaw in the people who did this. I mean, these are people of good faith working as hard as they can to solve a problem we've never solved before. But historically, standards bodies tend to have this problem. And so people in the consortium would try to innovate preemptively and state what the standard would be. And this would take place on a mailing list, and a long time would pass, and there would be lots of discussions, and those discussions would spawn discussions, and 2,000 days into it, somebody will pour cold water on it and send us back to the drawing board, and we have proposals on top of proposals on top of proposals for things which no one has bought yet. And potentially many years into this, we have a standard or a group of standards that nobody, not even most of the people who are involved in their making, are really very happy with anymore. But we call it a standard. And initially, web developers who are hearing about this for the most part for the first time now, many years into it, they think that these very smart people must have done something great, and they're very happy about it. And over time, as they read more and they begin to use it and they really experience the pain of using it in real life, they don't select it. And that's really important. The technical merits of it are not what is at question. The question is whether people will select it. The social aspect is just as important. And so, meanwhile, though, this problem that the consortium, one of the primary problems that it was designed to solve, is unsolved. We have all of these different places where things are going astray. We have one browser, Internet Explorer, that basically stopped its development at IE6, and it's frozen in time. And then we have these other browsers spring up that have increasing market share, and they play kind of political things to say we want to pull in this direction and we want to pull in this direction, and they're using the tools that they have at the time, things like vendor prefixes, and but none of them really solve the problem of this variance. So at some point, some people realized that this is not really going where we need it to go. It's not getting the adoption we needed, and there's too much politics involved, etc. And so we tried this not exactly a standards body approach, which is a similar group of people. It's a little bit more open, and there's this new decider role that's meant to speed things along. And ultimately, at some level, it looks very, very similar, and it involves many of the same people. But initially, they had so many raw materials left over from the backlogs of what was out there that they do make good progress and they deliver real value, and that makes developers pretty happy. And one thing that they did that was really good, which is kind of new, is that they acted like implementation dictionary editors, not for HTML, but for the underlying uh, thing that makes HTML work. And they took places where the HTML parser was not standard, and they standardized it. And that means that it is no longer SGML, but it is fully defined as a standard. And that's a really good thing. Um, this added another aspect. The decider can now say, I did it like this. And people can say, we refuse to do that. And so now we have many sources of truth for specs. We have the W3C and the WhatWG, and both of them have varying degrees of errata, or whether they're in draft status or whether they're actually implemented. And this is very difficult for developers. And so with the whole state of the system, this leaves us very unimpressed as a whole. Features take a long time. We don't know where they get roadblocked. It's very hard to speculate where anything will be in a year or two. And when we do get features after a long, long wait, very frequently, like app cache, there's something that isn't solving the right problem, and they leave us with a bad taste in our mouth. So around 2011, several people were having kind of similar-ish conclusions and a few ideas as to what was really broken about it. Following this same sort of natural onion model of one person talk to somebody else and they get together and they have some kind of proposal and it gets a little bit bigger and gets tweaked a little bit. And after a while, we came up with the Extensible Web Manifesto. And it's about rethinking what works and where the pain is and proposing how we can make that really click and stop the pain. And it asks standards bodies like W3C and WhatWG and participants in them to kind of reimagine and reprioritize their roles and their work. And I'd like to say that to their credit, they are. Largely in even in ECMA TC39 and all of the standards bodies and working groups. The Extensible Web Manifesto is cited frequently, and the TAG, W3C Technical Architecture Group, which is led by Tim Berners-Lee, has taken up a lot with the Extensible Web Manifesto and trying to redirect questions toward finding it in the platform and how we can help this kind of thing really make sense. And the fundamental primitives is a phrase that we use in the Extensible Web Manifesto, and that has to do with, like I just said, looking for answers in the existing platform. If we have a new feature, rather than add new magic to the platform, we want to try and refocus the question toward finding a layer, chromosomes or genes, or ultimately the DNA that are hidden in the existing platform that explain that. This is important, and it's important that we get something, even if it's not all the way down to the genetic level in the first pass, because every time we do, we add the ability, these creative powers that made the web, the unstructured creative aspect that Tim mentioned early, that allow authors to experiment and diverge and select. The problem isn't those. The problem is that those have been traditionally baked into browsers. And so the Extensible Web Manifesto is about how we tap into these ultra-important selective powers and ultimately provide a way to tighten the feedback loop. That's another phrase that's in the Extensible Web Manifesto. Meaning, rather than spend years developing something that no one will select, how do we tighten the feedback loop so that we find out what is something that's likely to be selected and include developers in that process so we can find out. And by uncovering these lower layers, we make it possible to create polyfills. Polyfill is a polyfill for a spec that isn't formal yet. So it's a proposal with an implementation, and the implementation is outside a browser. So this allows us to create these mutations in natural fashion and then step back and see which ones are getting selected and how maybe with slight changes they can be selected even more. But where would these new sources of polyfills come from? Well, they'd come from the same sorts of places that JavaScript libraries come from. And that's both a good and a bad, right? It's a good in the sense that we can give libraries a new kind of, people who write libraries a new kind of target to make this a proposal and try and think about it like that. And it's a bad because there could be an explosion. And here, though, we run into the same kind of caution that almost hindered Tim from getting take up, where you can look at that like a detriment, or you can look at that as that might be the thing that ultimately makes it work. So the question is there a way that we can help manage this at scale, right? Definitely mailing lists are not that. And definitely if it's just completely Wild West with nothing to help it, that could really easily get out of hand. So this is a problem that I think about because the social aspect is absolutely as important as the technical aspect. In fact, I would wager that it's more important. When Tim introduced the web, it already wasn't the best technical solution for a lot of these problems. And we have since seen technically better solutions offered that no one has taken. So I blogged about this in a thing called the Web Standards We Want, and I have a proposal called Chapters that I've been working on with some people around the world. There's a working pilot in place in Vermont in cooperation with the University of Vermont. And so far, it seems to be working a lot like the early web itself. Some people are interested in, and they're participating a lot. And the idea is we get local groups to discuss proposals and specs. And that these can be different sorts of people than traditionally work on specs. We can have professional practitioners and JavaScript library authors. We can partner with universities and colleges and have students and faculty and maybe some standardistas involved. And that everyone in this can get something different out of it. It can be very noisy, but it can have real world value to the participants. So students get kind of free education about this, as do faculty. It's very hard to keep up in our realm. And if you want to be a really good faculty, you need to keep up. And so one way to do this is by keeping you plugged in with the standardistas and the practitioners and the JavaScript library developers. Everybody can talk a lot more openly because it's just much, much harder to be a jerk in real life than it is on a mailing list. Everybody can get value out of this by contributing. And so everybody has something to contribute here. So one thing is, if I just ask the question, how hard is something to understand? It's unbelievable how much time is spent on that question in mailing lists. How hard, I think authors will not get this, or this will be more easy to understand. That is all speculation, and it's, for the most part, worthless. If we actually ask people, we can find out. If we not just ask people, but ask them to go ahead and use the idea, or collect information about use cases because we have something we can actually use, then suddenly it's very easy to be involved. The existing system is kind of hostile to that. So by doing this, we can have these people actually find polyfills and review them, or write them if they don't exist. And we can submit them to common places like MDN or webplatform.org. We can write tests for them so that we know and agree to all of the inputs and outputs and what it should do before anybody begins any kind of native implementation. And we can find out if people are actually selecting it and improve the proposal before it makes it into any browser. So this would help manage the noise in a system. It would help keep some kind of checks on things. It would help uh, groups collaborate and share what's working and what's not. It would help with the education, and it would help us collect hard selection information that is currently entirely lacking. And I think it can make the whole ecosystem better, and by providing some kind of basis, we can help transform existing standards bodies into something that really works.